I'd like to welcome you and introduce you to our audience out there that you can't see, but I promise you they're out there. Excited to have John Nielsen-Gammon, Texas State Climatologist, joining us. In addition to being the state climatologist, he's a Regents Professor and the Director of the Texas Center for Climate Studies at A&M, so he's a busy guy. Really appreciate you taking the time out to share with us some of the recent work and research you've been doing on drought and connecting that with groundwater and how all of the GCDs and folks in the groundwater space do their jobs. I'm not going to make a lengthy introduction, but want to thank you for this. I'm going to turn my camera off, let you make your presentation, then I'll pop back on to if we have any time for questions at the end.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So this is not just my work. This is also the work by a whole bunch of people, mostly a team organized by Jay Banner at UT Austin as part of his Coupled Natural and Human Systems project, which was funded by the National Science Foundation. And also we had contributing funding from the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, also UT's Planet Texas 2015 initiative. So thank you to all of those groups that made this possible, and thank you to everybody on this slide who is, except for the last bullet, is a co-author of a paper that was published in a journal called Earth's Future last year. I'll give you information on that at the end, but the material in this talk is derived from that paper. And the basic idea that the paper is exploring is the mismatch between the sorts of climate information and climate change information that's readily available and that scientists are accustomed to providing, and the sorts of information that stakeholders and the people on the ground are actually making decisions that require climate information to make the best decisions. What sort of information they need, and it's not often available. So, your typical information on climate change would be changes in temperature and rainfall. And just as a reminder, temperature is going up in Texas. Every single county in the state has seen an increase of temperatures by about 1/2 to 3/4 degree Fahrenheit per decade over the past 4 decades or so. And the long-term trend is a bit erratic, but it sort of mirrors the trends we see for global temperatures, as well as the trends for the globe projected from climate models. They're representatives of all of those on the graph on the left. Texas is the maroon curve, author's prerogative for color choice there. Interestingly, in Texas, the coldest decade was back in the 1970s, but since that time, temperatures have been rising even more rapidly than global temperatures, and it's expected to continue rising at a pace that's perhaps slightly larger than the global average pace. Rainfall, quite a bit more erratic, both from year to year and spatially. Unlike temperature, we see parts of the state that over even longer term trends, from going back to the 19th century, some places have seen a slight decrease of rainfall, others substantial increase. You need a magnitude of about 5 or 6% change to actually get something that's statistically significant. So in the western part of Texas, it's effectively no detectable change, but it's definitely been increasing in eastern Texas. But it's quite erratic. We had some big swings, of course, recently from 2011 to 2015. And extended periods of dry years, extended periods of wet years embedded within that. In terms of drought, there have been some papers that have come out recently that seem rather ominous, shall we say. For example, in 2015, a paper came out that looked at drought risk in the American Southwest and the Central Plains of the United States. And that paper is sort of like all the other papers. in the sense that it doesn't really focus on Texas. Texas is part of Texas is part of a much larger region. So you can't really say what they're projecting for the high plains is what's going to happen in Texas. But what they were projecting for the high plains was kind of alarming. They combined um, climate model projections to tree ring records of decade scale drought variations over the past 1,000 years or so. And what they found was the climate models were getting things in a sort of a permanent state that's drier than previous decades in the Central Plains, as best we can figure from tree ring data. So we were curious whether that same sort of result held up for Texas. We didn't really expect it not to, but it's useful to actually get that information in. So for tree ring data, the North American Drought Atlas includes tree ring data for West Texas and East Texas. In this particular data set, much of Central Texas is missing because it didn't have tree ring data in the archive that was used, but there is a paper that came out about a decade ago by Cleveland et al. That fills in some of the gaps for what's happening in Texas. Anyhow, if you look at long-term variations of the Palmer Drought Severity Index from tree rings, of course, there's wet periods and dry periods. I've highlighted in red the extended dry periods where the Palmer Drought Index stayed negative for more than a couple of decades. And in East Texas, that's mostly a long, long time ago. The drought of the 1950s didn't last long enough to make this cutoff. Although in West Texas, the drought during the Civil War era managed to be persistently dry. So this is mainly just for reference to the fact that we don't have a recent memory of those sorts of major events. Well, this is what the climate models came up with for West Texas, and I'll tell you, East Texas is fairly similar. You'll see that next. We used 3 different measures of drought intensity. One was the Palmer Drought Index in June, which was the time of year when trees were most sensitive to drought, and so we infer the tree ring record is telling us about springtime drought. And in addition to the Palmer Drought Index, we also looked at soil moisture in the top 30 centimeters of soil, as well as deep soil. Deep soil might be the most relevant parameter as recharge in many aquifers. And all of the model simulations had decreasing trends that sort of kick in around the beginning of the 21st century. But depending on what parameter you look at for drought severity, that affects how basically how historically unprecedented the future conditions might be. In West Texas, not so unusual for the topsoil because it gets dry there anyway, but for deep soil, things would dry out more than they have in the past. And for East Texas, sort of a similar thing, although not nearly as dire for deep soil moisture. Another way of looking at this is looking at whether different models are consistent on this. And what's highlighted here on the right is the middle 50% of models. So a quarter of the models are more optimistic than this, and a quarter of them are more pessimistic than this. But the general consensus is drying in West Texas for all these parameters. For East Texas, there's actually about 25% of models that say the long-term trend is going to be positive. It's going to get wetter, but and furthermore, they're consistently saying the Palmer Drought Index, which is the maroon color, will be quite negative, which indicates that actually what we say about future droughts depends on how we're measuring the severity of current droughts and future droughts. Personally, I think soil moisture is a bit more reliable than a drought index because it's a more direct measure of what's going on in the ecosystem within the model. But a lot of uncertainties here, and how you define drought is one of them. One last way of looking at this is the range of values of these 3 different drought measures for West and East Texas in the historical period, the tree rings, and then the future simulations. And what we see is the future simulations do tend to produce more dry conditions. The agreement between the model's historical simulations and the tree data is pretty good, but it's forced to be good. The models are calibrated against the observations. So the models actually shouldn't be taken to be as accurate as they appear in this diagram. So that's another source of error, not just how you're measuring drought, but how you're simulating future climate. So let's try to translate this into surface water supply and then groundwater supply. Many of the questions about the uncertainty for the future apply to both of those. For example, if you want to know what's going to happen to future water, it's sort of this layer upon layer of estimation. First estimate is how much carbon dioxide is going to be in the atmosphere in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. That's a climate projection, and it depends upon what our energy mix is, how intensive our use of fossil fuels are globally in 20, 30, 50 years from now. Depends on, how aggressive controls are, how innovative technology is. None of those questions have to do directly with the climate system, so they're outside of my expertise entirely. Getting into climate science, how much will the climate system respond to that increase of greenhouse gases? How sensitive is the climate to these sorts of changes? We know pretty much how sensitive it is to within about 50% or so still considerable uncertainty there. And then given what the globe's going to do, what's the local response? How's it going to affect weather patterns in Texas? Will summer be drier and winter wetter, or vice versa? Or how things going to work out locally? Then even if we know what changes are going to take place in rainfall, you still got to model the effect on hydrology, which depends not just on getting estimates of what would happen at the very local scale from these large climate models, but also what's going to happen to the vegetation and so forth in terms of, the mix of evapotranspiration versus infiltration. And then lastly, how important is all this compared to natural variability? Frankly, the precipitation amount changes are going to be relatively small compared to the amount of variability of precipitation, more than likely. But that's not the only change that matters. You've got changing temperature, you've got changing intensity of rainfall, you got potentially changing timing of rainfall, you got changes in how much water plants need because they become more efficient water users, but then they may grow more because they're more efficient water users. So you've got all sorts of moving parts here. And that's just for the water supply. Demand also depends upon climate change to a large extent. And that difference, supply and demand, really is going to depend upon the aquifers and what's going to drive the climate. How is climate change going to potentially stress the aquifer? If you got a fast recharge aquifer, something like the Edwards aquifer, mainly the climate impacts are probably going to be supply driven. You got changes in how much water is being fed into the aquifer versus evaporating before it gets incorporated in the aquifer, that sort of thing. For slow recharge aquifers, it probably doesn't matter, for the Ogallala aquifer, how much water is recharging, because its level is being driven by water use. It takes too long for, rainfall that falls now isn't going to affect the aquifer for 50 years or 100 years. So there, it's how much is climate change going to affect demand of water use? How much additional irrigation is going to be needed for agriculture? Then on the other hand, how much is agriculture going to change its practices in response to climate change? Is it going to shift to a less water intensive cropping, for example? And then, in between those two extremes, you've got some combination of demand driven impacts and supply driven impacts that are all going to influence what's going on. in our paper, we looked at 4 different sort of prototypical stakeholders. And one prototype was a small groundwater management district. And the things they were likely to need that they might not actually have available would be things like the prediction of the demand side response, which, you know, not that modeling groundwater is easy, but modeling how people are going to respond to climate change and how that's going to affect their use of groundwater. That's a challenging modeling question. In fact, modeling may not be the appropriate solution to that sort of thing. Probably you need something like a scenario driven thing, like, okay, what if people maintain their current water use patterns, or the current trend of water use patterns maintained, versus what happens if there's a significant change in climate and this sort of modification of behavior takes place as a result of that. Technical expertise. I'm going to show you an example on the next slide of what Austin Water did for their 100-year climate change projection. And the resources available for them to do that sort of study are simply not available for a small groundwater management district. And lastly, the thing they would need, among other things, short-term and long-term outlooks that are tailored to their information needs. You know, suppose I was able to say, average rainfall is going to decrease by 10% by the year 2050. It's not clear how you would actually be able to use that information in planning purposes. You know, a 10% change in rainfall doesn't imply a 10% change in recharge, for example. It doesn't imply a 10% change in water demand for surface irrigation. So there's all those moving parts that make it very challenging to translate a climate projection into the sort of information that's actually necessary for projection for management purposes. And that's me, at least, looking from the outside in as a non-manager. And there's even sort of a terminology issue here, because what we're talking about may actually be more aridity, greater aridity, rather than more droughts. If the whole climate system is getting drier, maybe not appropriate to think about it in terms of more intense droughts, because droughts by their nature are short-lived things. They end with wet periods. But if we're becoming systematically drier, that sort of requires a different response management approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be able to survive a more intense drought until things turn wet again. If things aren't going to turn as wet again, you may have to rethink how the system is going to behave during the wet periods as well as the dry periods. And here, by the way, is a list of all the different factors. I've mentioned most of them already. Most of them point toward drier conditions in the future. Some point to wetter conditions. I think the balance is on the drier side rather than the wetter side. And there's some things where it sort of depends. For example, more intense rainfall means more of what falls will go into runoff rather than infiltration. So certain aspects of climate change, like changes in rainfall intensity, will affect groundwater differently than it'll affect surface water. So I mentioned Austin Water as an example of an agency with lots of resources grappling with these issues. So their 100-year plan considered climate change, and what they did was they brought on board a climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, who provided global climate model projections of temperature and precipitation, which were downscaled and calibrated to historical observations of temperature and precipitation. And then, instead of doing a full-blown deterministic hydrologic model to simulate their surface water, which is their water supply, they decided to take a statistical approach and look at the statistical relationship between temperature and rainfall and stream flow, and use that same statistical relationship to infer what would happen under future conditions. And they took from the model of future conditions a couple of scenarios. A scenario that was similar to the drought of record, but different because it involved a greater temperature impact in the future climate. And they determined from the climate model simulations that something that was 3 times as severe as the drought of record was within the realm of possibility. And so they came up with water supply projections based on that. And so that stream flow was then tailored for direct input to the water availability model, which then simulated evaporation from reservoirs and so forth and so on. And according to the people who are involved with this, the key for success with this was working directly with climate scientists because, on the one hand, the climate scientists were able to figure out what sort of information they could supply that would be most useful. And then on the other hand, Austin Water and their stakeholders were able to understand the limitations of the information that the climate scientists were providing, and consequently were able to make appropriate use of that information. In other words, not treating it as a sure thing and not treating it as a random guess, but actually something in between where there's useful information, but probably not as much useful information as you'd really like to have. So we concluded our paper, which you can find online. As I mentioned, you can Google my name and the name of the journal, Earth's Future. There's not that many hits for me and Earth's Future because I don't know a whole lot about Earth's future, although I do know a little bit that might be useful. But some of the things we don't know that might be useful going forward would be better understanding of how much the aridity in Texas has changed over the past 8,000 years, where we've got a similar sort of climate to what we've got right now. It'd be great to have tools that you could actually plug in the downscale climate model projections as input into models of stream flow and groundwater. It would be useful to explore how we could adjust the drought of record to be able to ensure the same resilience to future droughts as we have to past droughts. Is it appropriate to say, let's design our resilience to be the drought of record plus 25% more intense, that sort of thing? Can you do that sort of thing and be something that would resemble what a future drought might look like? And lastly, obviously, what we need for scientists providing information to stakeholders is transparent communication about what it is we know, what we don't know, and why it is we don't know what we know, and for that matter, why it is we know what we know, so that the information can be used effectively. So, again, thank you for the invitation, for being able to talk with you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much for that. That was a great presentation, a lot of good information. I do have a couple of questions that came in. The first one was about the tree ring study results, and whether maybe those are limited in that they are providing insight into the general growth environment, but don't provide insight into level or frequency of flood.
Yes, so they are, not not very useful, especially for surface water, because they're missing the flood aspect. Excuse me. Plus, they're limited to the growing season, so there's not much relationship to what happened in our second rainy season, September and October, when a large portion of our floods occur. So in terms of a quantitative estimate of how bad the drought was in particular years, it's not all that great. On the other hand, it's probably informative as to the degree of variability in droughts in the climate system. We don't, in some sense, perhaps rainfall in September and October is even more variable than it is in the springtime, because it's less controlled by El Nino. So perhaps we end up with fewer extended droughts in the fall than we do in the spring. So there may be some differences in there, and it would be useful for the model simulations to be calibrated against some other measure of water availability, like total runoff, for example. That information is available. It needs to be calibrated against the observations. But yeah, that's a good reason why, as an example of what I'm talking about, that the information that's commonly output from climate models may not actually line up with what you really want to know.
And then another question came in about the Austin water and what they did, and they had used in future scenarios the drought of record and then 3 times the drought of record. Is that what we should be planning for? 3 times the drought of record?
That seems pretty severe to me. If you really, it's useful to to plan for a worst case scenario. That's different from ensuring that you've got enough water for everybody during the worst case scenario. But it's certainly, it's nice to know, have contingency plans in place for things getting substantially worse. One difference between surface water and groundwater is developing surface water resources, at least from what I've seen, takes a lot longer than developing groundwater resources. It takes a lot longer to build a reservoir than to build a desal plant for brackish groundwater. So Austin Water really had to take the long-term look and see what was going to be likely to be available 50 years from now, because they might have to plan to put in develop a resource now that would only kick in 50 years from now. For groundwater, you have a bit of a shorter timeline, so it's possible to not worry about the worst extreme scenario in the distant future and sort of stay on top of what climate science is saying for the near future and what's happening to our climate in Texas, because the climate's not going to drop off a cliff in 20 years. Changes are going to happen gradually and maybe hard to detect because of the erratic nature of climate. But I don't think groundwater districts need to worry about the 3 times the drought of record anytime soon.
And that's actually kind of a good segue into one last question that came in was about, and this might get in a little bit into the weeds, but in terms of groundwater conservation districts and their planning efforts, they get together in their GMAs and do their work to plan out for 50 years and desired future conditions. The question was whether or not we're at a point where these kind of questions about climate and drought and increased drought severity should be taken into account there, or are we not quite there yet in terms of what we know versus what we don't know?
Yeah, I think we're at the point where it is appropriate to take it into account if sufficiently relevant information is available. At this point, I think the information is pretty much qualitative. In other words, we can say, well, we're gonna have more evaporation. That's because of the higher temperatures. Or at least definitely more evaporative demand from the atmosphere. The amount of change is less clear, particularly when you start talking about specific impacts for specific water use and water supplies. One approach that can be useful in this sort of intermediate stage where we recognize it could be important, but we don't know we don't have numbers to work with, is to allow a margin for error. In other words, if we think there's going to be greater stress on the aquifer, you might say, okay, we'll allow for the possibility of 20% less recharge or something like that, and work through the numbers and see what would happen under that circumstance. And it may not be, it may be that we can put in a certain planning action that would allow us to easily adapt the plan if that sort of thing comes to pass. Because another thing that's useful at this stage of uncertainty is to see what sorts of nimble alternatives are available. That's a very useful exercise to go to so that you know what's in the toolbox once the future becomes clearer.
Toolboxes are good things. Well, thank you so much, John, for joining us and providing that great talk. we're signing off. We hope you, if you want, to come back and join us tomorrow for what we've got on, but appreciate you speaking with our membership and our attendees today.
Sure.